Matter Labs is the sort of inspiration behind this next panel, really for us, and a lot of this work came from Dark Matter Labs for us. Sarah's going to put up a slide. Are you, Sarah? Yep. That I wanted to just share. That when I saw this diagram, my understanding of what we're talking about from Dark Matter Labs fundamentally changed. I was like, oh, God, we really do know everything, but we have no way of understanding how to organize around it. And so I saw this diagram, and it was game-changing for me. And it just showed, don't worry too much about the language, but it just showed what happens when we have a home that is, let's just say, underperforming for a second. Maybe it's cold, maybe it's damp, maybe its air quality is poor, maybe there's many other things, and all the impacts it has, from noise pollution to air quality to humidity to overheating to many other things. And then it goes on to show all the different stresses that can create on your life. And then it goes on to show all of the impacts that has on all of the systems, from the NHS to many other places who are picking up the costs of that. And I remember Indy Johar, one of the founders of Dark Matter Labs, who you'll hear from at the Building Centre, because he's going to talk to us about materials and a few other things. I remember him saying, like, it isn't that we don't know this. It isn't that we don't know that if we improve the quality of our homes, we across the board, from both a justice and a financial and many other layers, the transformations that we can make at a societal level are so vast, right? And in the first slide I did this morning, we talked about moving from short-term programs to a long-term vision. And we've got loads more slides like this that you guys have done that show who's paying for what then, what are the police paying for, what are the CCG paying for, what are the NHS picking up, what are the council having to do, children who have asthma from poor quality homes, the amount of times they spend in hospital when they're young, meaning they're out of school, and the links to incarceration, and so on and so on. You know, there's all this work. Now, I'm not asking you to sit down here and be like, let me go into all of this complexity. But there was one thing that I remember that Indy and Dark Matter Labs said to me that just transformed my understanding of it. And Indy used to say, most of this is an accounting problem. It's not that we don't even know. And I was like, what do you mean? It was like, we know all of the transformations over the long term that happen if we improve our homes and our streets across. It's like the start, right? The start, a healthy home, a healing home is at the start of pretty much everything. It's just that we don't know how to account for and invest in those future liabilities and save them now. So we don't know how to improve all of that and say, we know that it will save us lots of money in the future, or it will do all these different outcomes across justice, across equity, across just a healthier society. And so I wanted to say that in the mixture of today and tomorrow, the whole point of today and tomorrow and the festival is just to keep provoking us and get us thinking. Not everything will resonate with everyone, but just if you're not an organizer on your street, if you're not like the big movement maker, or you're not like, I don't know, building a retrofit kit out there, maybe you're interested in skills, or you're interested in accounting, or you're sat here from the NHS, or you're a midwife who I was talking to Joe this morning, and the importance of care in these processes and how the lack of care led to quite a few relationships breaking down when certain programs happen. I just want to say that it's really important to be able to tap in and to think about, if you're feeling frustrated or cynical, or but what about that problem, but what about policy, but what about health, but what about street organizing, but I'm an architect, or you're thinking about materials, and God, they don't know that we don't have enough materials to do solar panels on every house. This is what this festival is for. It's not to have a truth up here. It's to be able to really unlock where you're coming from, bring your skills, your knowledge, encourage critique and debate and conversation, so we can get more people into these conversations, not just a bunch of social organizers and activists shouting over here, policy people shouting over there, architects coming together and saying, God, they don't understand what's needed. It's really about creating radical collaborations across us all. So I just wanted to invite you into why we thought this panel was a beautiful one to have, why Dark Matter Labs have been such a great partner for us in this collaboration over many years. And for now, I'm going to hand over to Dan, who will bring up the next panel. Thank you.
Thanks everyone for me. incredible introduction. You did a much better introduction than I could have done on our own work. So thank you so much. Thank you very much. First of all, it's an absolute honour to be here today. Thanks very much for inviting us, me and the Civic Square team. It's always great to be collaborating with yourselves, and it's really great to be in Birmingham and to be at the heart of this incredible place and incredible community, and to be sitting, as Claude said, in a swimming pool, which is absolutely brilliant. This building was opened, I understand, 116 years ago, and is about to undergo a 2-year renovation, but it was opened, I understand, partly to drive health and well-being in this community. Not just to go swimming, but to wash and to be clean and to be healthy, and now people are running yoga groups and all sorts of kind of like well-being events here. So very topical for our discussion today. First of all, I'd really like to welcome an incredible panel to talk today. And what I'd really like for this session is, we've had lots of different formats of discussion today, but this I'd really like to be interactive. And we're going to have moments in the sort of next 45, 50 minutes or so where I'm going to pause, and I'd like people to ask a question or make a point. When we do so, what I'll have to do is I'll probably have to repeat it so that the people on the live stream can hear it.
I was going to say last call to come forward if you can't hear, please. There's lots of space, okay? They're really, really important to move forward if you can't hear. Thank you.
Or even if you can hear, do move forward. Because it's lovely to see people closer up. So, yeah. Come on, everyone. Don't be shy. We're not going to be... not going to bite. So I'm just going to introduce the incredible panel we've got here today. Alice is a social researcher working with organisations across the housing industry, looking at the evidence around social value and how they create that social value and how they create it through activities, especially in retrofit. And you've done a lot of work, which hopefully you'll talk about the link between retrofit and health. Salma is the Associate Director for Health Inequalities Birmingham Solihull Integrated Care System. She has led on developing the 5-year inequality strategy, convening the Health Inequalities Stakeholder Board, and is also Vice Chair of the West Midland Mayor's Health of the Region Roundtable. Salma, is that all correct? I don't know how you find time to come here. Thank you very much. But also, she has a huge background in politics and has been named the most prominent Muslim woman in British political life as well. So we are really lucky to be here. It says here that you've appeared regularly on BBC Question Time. So I'm hoping today's audience will be slightly friendlier than that today. So yeah, but do ask some difficult questions as well if you need to. Craig is a chartered town planner at Arup in the local Birmingham office, and you've been working across lots of different placemaking projects, but also in particular for this conversation with Wolverhampton on the net zero neighbourhoods, which hopefully we'll come on to. And last but certainly not least, Kate, welcome. Kate de Selincourt is a writer and editor. She's got an amazing website. If you are interested in health, homes and well-being, definitely go and look at it, because there's some really amazing articles on there across the years that she's been looking at this on sustainable energy, the environment, and all other related matters. I suppose I just want to kick off by saying, obviously we spend around 90% of our lives in buildings, mostly our homes, and especially now our homes since the COVID pandemic. And so the quality of that environment is obviously incredibly important to our long-term mental, physical well-being, but also our productivity and all those other factors. And we've heard the kind of extreme, awful stories of people around mold and other things causing other problems. But just on a day-to-day basis, whether things are too hot, too cold, they're obviously really damaging for us. But also a healthy home can be incredibly enlivening and beautiful. I suppose we sort of want to hear, we hear the headlines. One of the big headlines is basically that leaky, damp spaces cost the NHS 1.4 billion a year. And last year, around 3 million households couldn't afford to actually heat their homes properly. So we want to hear, those are incredible statistics, but I suppose today I want to hear more about the actual stories and anecdotes about real people. So I'm going to start by asking Salma, if you're okay, to talk a bit more. Obviously, your local knowledge is incredible. You see across the region. What kind of health issues and challenges and stories are you seeing and have you seen over the years related to housing?
Thanks, Dan, for asking me to go first. I actually came here to listen more than talk. You heard, the various job roles. My role is a strategic one. I'm determined to bring to the attention of those people who hold the budgets and make those longer-term strategic decisions about how that is going to be spent in the interest of our citizens. You'd think this kind of stuff has always been done in the NHS, but actually, no. It's been very siloed, whether it's primary care or our hospitals, and everybody's kind of got the pressure to deliver their specific targets. So the role that I'm playing is actually a new one in the kind of ecosystem of healthcare. But from day one, I was determined that we tried to take that step back and bring in the wider determinants of health. And of course, housing and air quality are absolutely key factors. The day-to-day pressure of the NHS is waiting lists, it's ambulance. I'm on call every fortnight, and literally, we're looking at where are the ambulances lining up, what are the discharge rates. Those are the kind of metrics that the NHS is measured against. And I don't need to tell anybody here that with the funding over the last, how many years now? The pressures of that, combined with the huge swinging cuts to local government under austerity, we have seen the direct impact on health inequalities. Already, you asked me to share what some of the issues are. The way it's divided up now, the NHS is divided up into 42 systems across the country. Ours is called Birmingham and Solihull Integrated Care System, so it includes all the GP practices, all the hospitals, and both local authorities, Birmingham City Council and Solihull Council. We happen to be the most deprived ICS, it's called ICS Integrated Care System, in the whole country. We have over 50% of residents in Birmingham alone living in the bottom 10th percentage of poverty. So we often think of, it's just a few pockets or neighbourhoods, but no, the scale is huge in our patch. And Solihull, which we all kind of think is a bit more better off, because it is, but even within Solihull, you have pockets and neighbourhoods with equivalent deprivation. We're blessed with a very diverse population, in fact one of the most diverse in the country, if not in Europe. And as of last year, actually 2021 census showed we are an ethnic, global majority city. And even in Solihull, 20% of the population there is from, there's lots of different terms, but say ethnic minority background. But when you start mapping all of that, and then you say, well, where are the health inequalities? It's the intersectionality. First of all, deprivation, poverty itself is a massive, massive risk factor. The creation of the NHS came following the Second World War, and the idea was that we would start that levelling up. And it's played a huge role, massive role. But what the statistics show is that once austerity started to kick in from 2010, life expectancy started to go down. So we can literally see the evidence of that. And in Birmingham, if you live in Sutton Coldfield, you will live 10 years longer than if you live in somewhere like Balsall Green or Lascelles. And we see that pattern even like, say, in South Birmingham in areas like Druids Heath. So, crude language like the white working class areas, poverty has a direct impact on both how short your life's going to be, and then even within the shorter life that you have, 17 years of those years will be spent in ill health. So with some kind of long-term condition, whether it's diabetes or living with high blood pressure CVD or some kind of respiratory condition. And you mentioned linking to housing. We know there's a direct link, absolute direct link with health and housing, exacerbated in recent years with the Ukraine-Russian war and the energy price hikes, which mean cold housing, a drop of 1 temperature, we know we're going to see a rise in infant deaths and elderly deaths. Just 1 degree drop. And people can't afford to keep their houses warm. And if you're already living with a disability, you're more likely to rely more on electricity for items that you need, as well as keeping your house warm. And so again, we are disproportionately impacted, and this results in deaths, in earlier deaths, and in poorer living conditions, which themselves then create the very conditions which make you more likely to get another condition. So respiratory, we know that we can patch up kids, babies, who are impacted by mold. They come into hospital, if you're going to put it in very harsh economic terms, quite costly, patch them up, they go back. They're going back to the same environment which is making them ill, which is why we need that joined up thinking. That's been recognised, which is why the integrated care systems are talking about local authorities and NHS working closer together. Local authorities have got obviously more expertise around housing, but whether they've got the expertise needed for this agenda, the retrofit agenda, the air quality, the climate justice agenda, and then linking back to health, I wouldn't say necessary so, which is why places like this, the gatherings that you're having today, the expertise you're bringing together are so key. Because actually, the reason I've come here is, like I said, actually to listen, because I feel the expertise and the experience and the skills that we need is here, and I would like to be that kind of conduit back, not the other way around. So if that's a very quick summary, there's loads I can say about health inequality, it's my passion, and there's lots to share, but I want to listen to the expertise on the panel and in the audience here, and happy to kind of come back when it comes to the discussion.
Thank you very much, and yes, do remember, do get some questions ready, because I'll come out to the audience quite soon. But thank you, Salma, that was incredible. I mean, Alice, would you like to expand a little bit further and talk about some of the work you've done around connecting retrofit and health in particular, and the evidence and the strength of the evidence either way?
Hi everyone. Yeah, so as Dan introduced me, I'm a researcher, and I've done a large piece of work recently summarising that very complicated slide that you saw at the beginning, digging into all the evidence about how is health and housing and poor housing and energy inefficient housing, how is it linked to health? So as you saw from that slide, it's incredibly complex. There's lots of pathways where poor housing can affect your health. And as I was saying, overall, the sort of headline stats are, that ultimately cold housing kills people, and that's really a depressing place to be, that, thousands of people, tens of thousands of people across the nation die each winter because they're living in cold housing. And we know the kind of physical connections between that, so people with heart conditions, with respiratory conditions, older people and young children are more likely to be vulnerable to that. So I think it's worth knowing that as part of the conversation about retrofit, because if we focus just on properties, then we're just looking at what are the features of the properties. If we bring in the story about the people and the health and looking at where those vulnerabilities are, we can make a much more bigger impact. We can bring in the carbon savings and make a health impact as well. So I think we need to link those two elements together. So there is the physical health side, and as we know, if you live in poor housing, you're more likely to go to hospital and as you said, burden on the NHS in terms of those admissions and things. But in terms of life impact, that's obviously very difficult for someone to go through and live through. So we know that there are particular groups that we could focus on to bring the benefits of retrofit and carbon savings, but as well the health benefits. Some of those groups are quite focused, so particular health conditions and older people. But one of the clearest evidence that's sort of coming out of this link between health and housing is actually around the well-being impact of living in a poor, energy efficient or cold home. And that, I think, is coming out really strongly, and it's quite a universal finding that there are multiple stress factors if you live in a cold home that you can't afford to heat. So you're worried about paying the bills. Your health is suffering, so you're worried about your health. You might be all crowded into one room because you're just keeping one room home, and that's stressful. I've got 3 kids, and I do not want to spend the whole time in the same room as them. And also things like, worrying about paying the fuel bills and the lack of sense of control. You can't change it, and that's really stressful. So all those factors kind of pile on top of each other, and that's why when you look at the research, the physical health benefits are sometimes limited to those people who have particular health conditions, but the mental health and the well-being impact is quite universal across young people, across parents, single people and older people. So I think that's really important to bring into the conversation. It does make it a bit difficult because there's not a department for well-being, unfortunately, and not yet. But as I was saying in the introduction, I am sort of from the accountancy side of things to try and put some pounds and pence figures on those kind of softer impacts, to say this is part of the picture, that's part of the return on your investment. If you invest in properties, you not only reduce the energy, it's about improving people's health and improving people's well-being as well. And I think we need to build that into Retrofit to be able to have that understanding and evidence, but also the stories of, making that evidence personable, telling the stories of people who have experienced that, which is a big picture, but making it personable that people can relate to as well.
That's really helpful. Thank you. Talking about stories, we have another journalist on the panel. We had some earlier on as well. Kate, I'd love to hear any of the stories that you've been writing about and talking about over the last little period. I'm also going to ask see if we can stop that person bashing whatever it is they're bashing. Yeah, thank you, Amy. Is there a mic on that side, or is this?
There is.
Okay, thank you.
Okay, is that all right? Oh, okay, so I talk quietly, so there's only one lot of voice. Not an echo. All right. Well, I was talking to Dan earlier, and there's a couple of stories stick in my mind. There are so many. One of them was a family that moved into a very deep retrofitted house in Lambeth, and the child had a serious lung condition, and he used to wake up in the night, and they moved into this new place which was warm and extremely well ventilated, and she said she never coughs anymore. This was like a 3-year-old kid, so you can imagine the worry of hearing your child cough night after night, and she says no, I haven't heard her coughing, which is, you can't even put money on that, but obviously there is money attached to it. And myself, I've visited a project in South London where the kind of deck access 1930s flats, so quite nice to live in, I think, but very cold and prone to damp. And in fact, before they'd even come and done the energy retrofit, which was quite complicated because retrofitting around the balconies, they'd already put in very good ventilation systems that are very quiet, which is really important with ventilation. And I met a woman who just had hers fitted, and the whole family had respiratory issues. And so I said to her, so how have you all been since this was done? And she just said, we can breathe. And it was just so powerful.
So moving.
Hear. Yeah, just incredible. And it's, and that's the transformation in someone's life, really, from going home and knowing you're going to start coughing again to going home and knowing you're home. Big difference.
Thank you very much. Maybe we'll hear a couple more of those great stories. I want to bring yourself in now, just to talk a bit more about this idea of health in a community, and a place, because the work that Civic Square and other groups are doing is all about working together on some of these issues. And it'd be great to hear about the work that yourself and colleagues are doing in Wolverhampton around the net zero neighbourhood.
Thanks, everyone. So I was trying to think how to structure this discussion. I think I was trying to pick us up some key themes around promises, knowledge, places and people. Because I think sometimes you can talk about retrofit and it's about the building, but it's obviously about the people that live there and the impact it can have. So it's been really inspirational hearing the rest of the panel talk today and think about my child at home, and I've seen him move house and his eczema's got a lot better from being in different accommodations. Do you start to see this in your day-to-day life and your family as well? So I think it's really important, really. But I'll start with the promise, and the promise was around, I suppose, what our leader, Arup, committed to with Andy Street in the West Midlands about working with Wolverhampton on their net zero neighbourhood programme before any of us really knew about it. So thinking about how do you follow through on that promise and make a difference in places, I think, for me, really. And as a town planner, that's really what I start thinking about. It's about places, how we sort of accommodate change and growth and make a difference to the communities in which change does happen. So promises are really important. But it's about knowledge as well, and obviously you'll probably be aware Arup is a big international company. We get involved in loads of different projects, tackle challenges that other people can't always address. So we know climate change is one of the biggest challenges facing us, and we try and get the answers. Not sure we always have all the answers, but we do try and get them. So we do a lot of work with cities across the world, and we prepared our Green and Thriving Neighbourhoods guidebook to help places actually try and deliver some of that change they need to do. And that's about the buildings themselves, but also about the place in the community that need to grow and develop as well. So that's really about that knowledge that we bring to this. And it's really sort of interesting to hear about that case you make for that investment and actually linking into the wider health benefits that are needed. We've done some work for Leeds recently about how we can sort of start to make that link between the stress and anxiety caused by people not being able to afford the heating or worried about when they're putting it on, and how that can strengthen the case for investment in these places, which is really important. Come on to the complexities of funding models for retrofit in a little while. Then it's about the places and people, and that's where we got into Wolverhampton. So when we were appointed by the council to support them on their funding bid initially, they picked the Graiseley ward of Wolverhampton, which is just on the southwest of the city centre, if you know Wolverhampton. But it's one of the most deprived in the country, in the top 10% of the index of multiple deprivation. So all the indicators indicating that it needs support. The communities there are struggling. But it's also a rich community as well. And actually, I think sometimes that can get lost in the discussion around how do you actually communicate with the people in these places to get the change that's needed. So in this particular community, I think nearly half of the people are from sort of black and ethnic minority backgrounds, but also up to nearly a fifth of the community weren't born in the UK. So you're talking about language here, and actually how do you start talking to these different communities about some of that change that is needed? That is a challenge. Fortunately, from our work in Wolverhampton, we didn't have that time to actually go out and talk to some of those communities, but I think that's a big challenge for me, how that is addressed. But then I suppose thinking about the health of the place as well. So Graiseley was in one of the sort of highest health challenges in Wolverhampton itself. We start looking at the place itself as well as a building. So obviously you had EPC ratings that weren't great in homes. You got the cold and all the issues that can bring. But you start looking at the environment that's around there, and I was fortunate because I live relatively local, popped out and looked on the site, went to one of the sunniest days in the year that we did that work. So you start seeing how bright and attractive it can be, but then you start noticing the things as well that are challenges. So you've got gated off areas, you've got fly tipping that happens in the area, and then you start wondering what this place is like at night time for people to go out and sort of have healthy lifestyles, as well as during the daytime, where they always feel comfortable walking to some of the parks and green spaces they have in those areas, so they can live healthier lifestyles themselves as well. So I think for me, the retrofit, creating sustainable neighbourhoods, is really about understanding the place and the people at the heart of it. There's lots of challenges then in terms of actually how do you go into people's houses, do the retrofit benefits. There's a poster up on the balcony over there which talks about so that won't be enough. So we are talking about, it's these substantial changes we need to do to people's places, and that can be disruptive, and we all live different ways in our houses. So actually how do we start having those appropriate conversations, getting people involved in this, so they're sort of buying into the process and sort of support that delivery, because the danger is it will just be another capital programme, someone coming in, doing works, and then people are almost trying to live those same lives they've always lived, rather than some of the ways that we need them, that behaviour to be different going forward. And then I think just going back to that point around how we make the investment case for this, because this is a massive programme that needs to be delivered. In Wolverhampton, we were looking at a funding pot of about 1.65 million, which I think when we looked at it in terms of some of the interventions we could do, you're talking about 100 homes or so that could be improved with the level of investment that are needed. And that was part of an area of Wolverhampton where there's about 5,000 homes. So it's very minuscule, but you need those pilots and demonstrator programmes that you have in Balsall Heath to sort of start showing you what can be achieved at scale and sort of taken out to the wider community, really. So I think, going back to what I said about at the start, it's around that promise to those places and communities that things will get better and that investment can be made in those areas.
Thank you very much. That's really beautifully said. I mean, so the situation that health in housing is a really interesting and very, very complex thing. You talked about behaviour, we've talked about kind of underlying conditions, mental well-being, physical well-being. I mean, Alice, are there easy ways of finding the connections between these that are kind of, which will allow us to talk about funding it properly? Because at the moment, that's not happening. I just wondered if that was something you thought was even possible.
I don't think there's easy ways around any of this, unfortunately. But I think with the changes to the NHS that Salma was talking about, you're probably better equipped to talk about this than me. But the changes towards a kind of a place-based population health approach means that in the kind of integrated care systems, housing providers, energy companies are around the table having those discussions with health. And that's the first step, I think, that we're on the same page. You've got plans that recognise that interlinkage between the two issues, and then start to think about how you can combat it. And then on the ground as well, trying to think about which stakeholders are impacted, that if it's about more than just energy efficiency, it's about health, then who are the people who know where those groups are that are suffering from those issues that are likely to be relevant to be improved through retrofit? What information do they have, and what relationships do they have with those people on the ground as well to engage them? Because I think one of the points that this flags as well with health and retrofit is that sometimes the people in the poorest health who can benefit the most are least equipped to go through that retrofit process and to engage with it in the first place, and that's the prospect of a big change to their home might be enough to turn them away at the door. So I think we need to think about the wraparound support from health and community support to guide and help people with health conditions who are going to benefit, but to engage with that programme and to go through the process as well as it's happening in their home. So it's about thinking about targeting the right people, but also getting them to engage in the journey and the support that they need to do that, I think.
Great points. I suppose then talking about back to money again, I don't want to focus on it entirely, but there has been some work done around through energy systems catapult, looking at some kind of early payback for people who are vulnerable. Some from an NHS perspective, where is the NHS here thinking about in this space around kind of thinking about money and resources and how we focus and target and actually prevent some of these things from happening?
I think it's at different stages in different places is the honest answer. And so it's always looking to those who are a bit ahead of where you're at to kind of then put the pressure back on, saying, look, we can't just say this is too difficult or it's so complicated, because then it's kind of a get-out clause. And there are places, whether it's in places in London or in West Yorkshire, where we've seen the NHS take up its role in what is termed as anchor institution. So as an example, the NHS is probably the biggest employer in the country. It has its own estates. We're talking about housing, as in the homes we go back to and sleep in. But in terms of the estate itself, if the NHS was to retrofit and fulfill the net zero ambitions itself, that will have a big impact. The kind of thing I'm trying to I kind of see myself as an insider-outsider trying to constantly radicalise the kind of mainstream. So imagine having energy produced using some of our estate, not only to fulfill the energy of our own buildings, whether it's GP practices or hospitals, or for that then to provide the energy for that local area. So talk about contributing to health and well-being, and you're saying we need a well-being director. Actually, we've got something called the Health and Well-being Board, which is the ultimate accountable board, both in Birmingham and Solihull. So the well-being agenda is one that is being talked about, that is being championed, but we need that imaginative approach and that alignment. And so as an example, I invite John, I'm a huge fan of John, I'm here because John invited me, that he comes to those stakeholder board meetings, he's presented what's happening in Balsall Heath, because I think for me it's not just about saying, oh look, here's the big people who make the big decisions and here's those poor neighbourhoods and we're going to come in and we're going to do something. Because actually, I mean it when I say I see the solutions here. I see people like Imi, I see what's happening in the north parts of Birmingham there, what's happening in Balsall Heath. On paper we can talk about all the poverty and the lack and the need, but actually the most creative solutions, which would not only benefit the local people there, but actually would benefit the whole city and indeed the country, are emerging from those very same places. And so connecting, as you're saying, just bringing the right people together to have those exchanges is really, really important. So it may be slow and painstaking, but actually it's through those relationships, because do not underestimate, and I have to remind myself of this every day when I go into work, do not underestimate how people are living in their own bubbles and how removed people can be from the realities as well as the creative solutions. And so I'm, for example, just challenging this language around hard to reach communities, and even as a soft pushback where there's assumptions that people wouldn't be interested. It's an assumption that the green agenda is a white middle class agenda, and we're going to have to do something really complicated to reach those brown and black people and get the buy-in from them, and maybe we have to get the imam to persuade the people or the gurdwara. No, people are ready, people are willing. It's our services and authorities that have been hard to reach, not the communities.
Not just ready, like much of the knowledge that created so much of how we understand living in relationship with the land and nature came from the global south, came from life before, like the most recent colonizations, and so it's like this idea that there is that knowledge has been pushed down and it has been marginalized, and actually that relationship is at the heart of like why we have such a significant breakdown between people and planetary health, because we have colonized the world for its resources. And so when that plays out to be like, oh, we didn't quite get there, or we didn't do this, it's actually just a 21st century version of of what's led to this. So I do really think it's important to bring that into the room, because it's literally like seeing the problem from the wrong direction, like literally the wrong direction. And so, sorry, I got really like, I was like, I need to say something.
No, it's great. Please.
Well, I take that as a huge compliment. It's about what resonates, and again, hearing your experience and having your lived realities being reflected is so important, because it's so isolating when we don't. My actual background is a psychotherapist, so it's unpacking and witnessing that, and then valuing it and respecting it, not pitying, and having humility as to where the learning is. And there are hard cash questions involved. So the work that you're doing about articulating very clearly, well, if you're not going to be convinced by the moral argument, if you're not going to be convinced by the social or health and well-being argument, here's the money argument, because actually what we're doing now is absolutely crazy. We're just throwing more money down this pit. And actually, if we do it this way, there's a real win-win-win. This is not just about it's going to be expensive and it's going to be a drain. This is actually going to make life easier for everybody. But the arguments do still have to be made, and we have to kind of gird ourselves with patience. We have to kind of make them again and again and again, because it's not like the penny might drop with one person and then And that's why working collectively in that stakeholder way, finding the right levers, find the right boards to have this discussion is still a key part. But what actually is going to feed into that is what's happening here. And so never ever underestimate. And it may seem, a thankless job, and you may think you're not getting the attention or the notice or the support. And I absolutely can understand why you'd feel like that. But also don't underestimate that actually there are people noticing, and there are people valuing, and that this space and you as individuals and what you're bringing to this is so key to our future.
I'm going to open it up now for any questions that people might have. There's a gentleman in the grey overcoat, I think it is. If what will happen is, just tell me the question. I'll repeat it so that everyone can hear it, maybe. Also for those online as well.
Thank you, everyone. Thank you, panel. Thank you for coming. I'm here. I do a lot of work with the community and with the Rainbow Black into my life. I could ask lots of questions, but I was just thinking about kind of what the panel have said and about lessons learned and about the pandemic. And I want to know whether it gets listened, because this is very much we're here to listen. So, what were the lessons that the NHS took forward when dealing with the pandemic on there, and what changes have come about that the community can see the benefit of? So that's just a question for all of you guys.
Great. I'm going to take another question, and then we'll have more than one question going. The gentleman at the front.
Well, I'm from Central Ladywood. I've been through a redevelopment in the 1990s, which is more or less done right. The tower block I lived in was retrofitted. It made an enormous difference, so it's been allowed to deteriorate again since. But we're now in the opposite situation. Back in the 1950s, the council has just announced that it's going to basically demolish the whole area, including most of what they did in the 1990s, hand it all over to a greedy developer, and we're being treated like cattle. Well, yeah, I mean, we're stage before, I think, regeneration or retrofitting or anything like that. We've got to force these so-and-sos to listen to us and work with us. And if anybody's got any ideas here, please tell us.
Thank you very much. Great, so we've got two quite different questions. The first question was about what we learned from the pandemic, or what have been the ramifications for this whole piece. Does anyone on the panel? Yeah, Kate?
This is quite a sort of technical answer, but I do know that since the pandemic, one of the things that people became very aware of was the importance of good ventilation, as we understood it was an airborne disease, as a lot of diseases are, like flu and so forth. And it was noticeable that people in poorer housing tended also to be more prone to more severe COVID and more hospitalisations. And I think one of the reasons for that is probably if you can't afford to keep your house warm, then you're much less likely to ventilate it because it makes it colder. And there has been recognition that that ventilation is an important part of retrofit, and that people, if you just make people warm, that's not enough. You've got to give them a good air supply as well. And if the ventilation is noisy and lets in the noise from the street and so on, then that's not good enough. And I have seen, listening to people talking about retrofit, the big social housing decarbonisation fund programmes that are going on, that it's being taken more and more seriously, which is good news. And on a completely unrelated note, more speaking to what Salma was saying just now, I did visit one of the SHDF retrofit programmes in Kent, actually this was, and it was very noticeable, and the people who invited me to go and look at it, who were running the programme, the contractors, said, we really want you to come down and meet the people on the ground. It's the best site I've ever worked on because it's really collaborative, and a lot of the really clever solutions to doing these tricky jobs like fitting a window so it's not leaky and it doesn't get damp around the side were actually, surprise, surprise, devised by the people actually up the ladders and on the scaffolding. And the culture on that site really recognised the contribution that the trades could make, and also they had a really good relationship with the community who lived in the houses. And similarly, they found that really valuable to smooth the path to do a good job, because they would go round and just knock on people's doors and people would chat to them and they'd say, oh, they've left such and such not finished over there on, you know, Mary's house or whatever. And they had a really warm, friendly relationship with the people in the homes, and it just made the whole job run so smoothly. And this is one of the big obstacles, is that it's, as you say, if people just come and drop it on from above, then it's not well designed. If people talk to the occupants of the homes, and they talk to the people who are actually going to be using their hands to do the work, then you can design a far better job which works technically and it works socially and it's not as expensive. And you only have to do it once.
Sounds incredible. Thank you. Does anyone else on the panel want to cover off any of those issues around the COVID response? And I'm looking at Craig here mainly partly for the issue. I mean, this whole thing about demolition and redevelopment has become more and more an important issue, and not just obviously critically for the people who are living there, for whom it is a fundamental issue of their own well-being in their homes, but we've seen, you know, talking about the narrative of the national press, I think in the earlier on session, this question of, say, the M&S on Oxford Street. And it's a very different context, but that went right up to the Secretary of State to talk about, you know, whether demolition was the right approach and how you balance all these factors out. So, yeah, I don't know, Craig, have you got anything to say about that? And obviously, anyone else wants to talk about any of those issues?
Yeah, I think I'll look at it just in the context of, I suppose, those traditional models that are probably in place that sort of force people down certain routes through certain sort of ways, because that's how they get the funding or the decisions made on them. So just keeping it linked to the health discussion today. So the work we did in Leeds around their sort of social housing programme was sort of how can you make that wider case with those wider benefits that Retrofit can bring with it. So traditionally, when I suppose applying for sort of Green Book compliant funding, government terms, let's try not to get too technical, but it's very much based on the sort of the energy savings for the user and the CO2 savings if you're going to be retrofitting a house. But actually, when you start to bring in those wider health benefits you can bring for this, so our study looked at some of the stress and the anxiety that's caused, and sort of when that was all factored in, linked to some research from the Greater Manchester Combined Authority, you started getting this benefit cost ratio, which basically, does it tick the box to get funding or not, and how strong is it? It went from I think we're 1.35 to a 2.15 when you brought in those wider things. These are numbers, they probably mean something to someone somewhere staring at a computer screen, but it makes it better by bringing in those wider approaches to see what's needed there. And I think this is where we've been trying to advise some of our clients recently on how do you actually start repurposing some of those buildings. So it goes beyond just a retrofit, where you're seeking to improve the existing use of that building for the people that live in there. But we've also got, I suppose, buildings like the one we're in today. How do we sort of maintain that future for those buildings? If they can't still be used for a swimming pool, what else could they be used for, rather than that traditional model of demolish and build again? Because we've been through that time and time again. And if we're going to get anywhere near to achieving net zero, we've got to find those models to find those uses for buildings that, you know, probably have been sat there on the high street empty or will continue to come forward on the high street. What's the models we need to be looking at, the uses that people need to make sure that, you know, we get some of those wider benefits delivered in society.
I've got lots to say about COVID and the NHS, but I'll say just a few things. What COVID did actually was shine a light on existing and entrenched inequalities. And it allowed that to go further up the political and NHS agenda. So as an example, we know that if you're from a deprived background, if you're on a lower income, you're much more likely to die if you got COVID. And the same with if you happen to be from an African Caribbean or a Pakistani or Bangladeshi background. And it's interesting, the race element almost became higher than the deprivation element. 9 out of 10 of the first NHS doctors who died from COVID were Pakistani, Arab or black, and actually all were Muslim. So it shows intersectionality of these issues on health and well-being, susceptibility, vulnerability to all sorts of income. So obviously doctors are not there deprived on the poverty level, but they were not protected when it came to being on that front line, perhaps not getting as much support or more further things being expected of them in an unsafe way. That's just one element. But from the wider population health point of view, for the first time, a national health inequality duty came into being, and that's where my role comes in. And we kind of were testing this out, and we argued for this. And without boring with all the other details, one thing direct for communities is we have managed to ring fence here, locally, £30 million for a Fairer Futures Fund, which we've given over to the council to hold, but it will be for communities, and this is something that I've very much advocated for, and I'm really pleased I can say here's a tangible result. For initiatives which are not just your short-term 6-month contract, which is what small community groups are always having to fight over, but for stuff which are at least minimally for 2 to 3 years. And another thing that we fought over, because we've got our 10-year outcomes framework developed around what are the biggest killers, what are the biggest contributors to ill health, so things like cardiac issues, diabetes, but managed to put in air quality as a metric. So here's a heads up to start thinking about getting together with other local groups and working together with local authority and NHS colleagues to put in a bid. I'm not saying it's massive amounts, in the bigger scheme of things, but it's getting it's a foot in, and that whole narrative about linking health and well-being agendas to housing and retrofit. We've got a tangible lever. It's not just and it's taken a year just to work up some of the criteria and processes, and it's next 2 months I think we'll be there ready for communities to start bidding in.
Thank you. Thank you very much. That's great to hear, and definitely important to actually have that funding in place for a little bit more time. We need to wrap up shortly. I thought I'd just finish on a more positive note, because some of this stuff can be quite difficult, by asking a question which is inspired partly by Imi, who talks a lot about the dream world. What is it you would do if you could let your imagination run free? And so I'm going to ask each of the panel members if they had sort of essentially kind of like a magic wand or infinite power and money within what's the one thing that they would do to really address some of the sort of challenges that we've seen here? Who's going to volunteer to answer that? Go on, Kate. Thank you so much.
Is that on? Yes. Okay, well, I'm going to say one thing at the immediate practical scale, which is for respiratory nurses and doctors to be able to prescribe ventilation for people's homes, and on a larger scale for the there was a figure in the BRE research that Dan quoted about how so many £1 billion across the NHS. What the BRE also found, which is a really important statistic I think, is that every pound that the NHS has to spend because of the consequences of poor housing, there's another £11 in terms of all the knock-on effects to the economy. Someone not going to work because they have to take the kid to the doctor, someone, bereaved, which is, you know, someone losing a family member too young, the cost of actually just not being at work because you're ill, or not being able to work because you're ill, the cost of, as well as on top of the cost of things like hospital admissions. And there is some good hard data on hospital admissions. In Carmarthenshire, they did a massive study of, I think, 9,000 households, so it's about 30,000 people, and they tracked them over 10 years. Most of them at some point had some retrofit work done on their houses. And after the retrofit, they did all sorts of fancy statistics, but they showed a 40% drop in people going to emergency admissions in hospital. There's people over 60, and which is young, because I'm over 60, so it's a lot of people. And a nearly 60% drop specifically in people having emergency respiratory admissions. So the data is there. And if anyone's doing a project to respond to Salma's suggestion, ask John for my details and I can help you with the technical stuff to put in your bid.
What an offer. That's absolutely brilliant. So we've got money, we've got a way of finding the money. Please queue up at the end. Does anyone else want to have a bash at my Dream World challenge?
I think in a dream world, so I'm an impact consultant, I like to think about impact, but impact is long term, and I just get so frustrated by the, you know, we can't push beyond a political cycle, we've got to think long term, and if impact could be a real thing that we think about and drive towards as you know, a vision of where we're trying to get to, and that we could, you know, the funding would match that and follow that, that would be the dream world.
So evidence-based
Yeah.
impact, yeah,
Yeah.
absolutely.
I don't know if it's appropriate in the hat that I've come in today. But I think we really need our whole political and economic system not to be geared for profits for the few, but for genuinely for the well-being of all. And that would mean very basic things like windfall tax on energy, put that into well-being, put that into retrofit, make sure that we've got sustainable fuel alternatives so that we're not constantly in this cycle, so we're not always having to react, and that we have that sustainable income. The NHS should not be an illness service, it should be a well-being service. We need to connect with social care as well. So you asked me for a dream world, where we have a minimum basic income so that people are not, their talents and their contributions are valued, and you have the freedom to think, and you're not for me, debt is another form of slavery, mental slavery, as well as literally the kind of physical impact that it has. And I fear that our young people, through the student debt, are already, that's where I think it was a very sinister move, if I may say. So there are big, because you asked me for a big wand here. So those things, so that connection in the individual, your family environment, your street, your social, connecting right back up to our environment. For me, none of these things are contradictory to each other, but it is about, you know, the fact that we have to keep making a certain type of economic arguments because that's the constraints of the political and economic. But they never tell us they can't afford a war. They never tell us, you know, because the fact is the money is there. We're still amongst, you know, the top 10 richest countries in the world. These are human choices ultimately. And so it is about being awake. It is about making sure your local representative in the bits of democracy that we have feel that pressure from us. It is about being consistent. And finally, you know, going back to what we've got here, you know, it's been a joy being here. Look at just even the fact that you chose this space. Right, we could have had the same discussion in a miserable building and it would have felt very different. But, you know, we can breathe here. We can experience the sun coming through. We can see the beautiful colours around us. You know, as human beings, these are things that are very important, evocative, and key, actually, to our spirit and who we are, as well as our physical selves. So it's this, Imi's dream world, why can't we have a bit of that every day anyway?
Thank you, Salma. And yeah. And Craig?
Yeah, literally, I'm in the deep end here, aren't they, physically and probably speaking wise. But I think for me, probably switching it from a dream and almost thinking, actually, it is about the delivery here. We need things to be happening in the real world, really. And how do you do that with retrofit and the wider benefits that can bring? And I suppose if you're thinking big, should there be some sort of national agency to make sure this happens? To think about what went through in Wolverhampton, we picked an area where there was quite a big mix of different housing typologies. So it wasn't just about the social housing there, it's about the private rented sector as well and the standards you get there. It's about private housing and actually how do you convince people to get involved, what the delivery structures we need. So I think actually we need a different approach to drive some of this forward and inspire people to get on and do the job.
Thank you very much. And can I just say, I haven't met all of you before, but it's been an absolute pleasure to hang out and have a great chat. And thank you for the questions from the floor. I just everyone can just thank the amazing panel in a normal way. Thank you.